Dr. Rebecca Torres had spent 15 years as chief curator at the Boston Museum of Photography, but she'd never seen anything quite like the collection that arrived on that cold March morning. The estate sale of the Whitmore Photography Studio had yielded over 3,000 glass plate negatives and original prints dating back to the 1880s, when the studio had been one of Boston's most prestigious portrait establishments. Rebecca stood in the museum's climate-controlled archive room, carefully removing photographs from acid-free boxes. Most were typical Victorian portraits, stiff families in their finest clothing, stern businessmen, young couples on their wedding day. The formal poses and serious expressions were characteristic of an era when photography was expensive and rare, each image a precious keepsake. Then she lifted out a particular photograph that made her pause. It showed a family of 4 in what appeared to be the Whitmore studio itself, identifiable by the distinctive painted backdrop of a garden scene that appeared in many of their portraits. The photograph was dated April 1889 on the reverse, written in faded ink along with the notation, "The Family." A man and woman sat in ornate chairs, dressed in respectable middle-class attire. The man wore a dark suit with a high collar, his thick mustache carefully groomed. The woman's dress was modest but well made, her hair arranged in the popular style of the period. Between them stood a boy of perhaps 12 or 13, and in the woman's lap sat a smaller child, a girl of about 5 years old. Something about the image felt wrong, though Rebecca couldn't immediately identify why. The composition was standard, the lighting professional, the poses appropriate for the era. Yet there was a quality to the photograph that made her uneasy. She brought it to her examination desk, turned on the high-intensity lamp, and reached for her magnifying glass. That's when she noticed the child's eyes and her blood ran cold. Rebecca's magnifying glass hovered over the little girl's face. The child's eyes were open, staring directly at the camera, but something was profoundly wrong with them. They had a strange, fixed quality, glassy and unfocused in a way that seemed unnatural, even for the long exposure times of 19th century photography. The other family members showed the typical slight blur of movement that occurred when subjects couldn't remain perfectly still, but the child was absolutely motionless. She moved the magnifying glass down to examine the girl's posture. The mother's hands were positioned carefully around the child's torso, not in a casual embrace, but in a way that seemed to be holding her upright. The child's own hands lay limp in her lap, fingers slightly curled in an unnatural position. Then Rebecca noticed the neck. She adjusted her magnifying glass, leaning closer to the photograph. Around the child's throat, partially hidden by the high collar of her white dress, were faint marks, dark impressions in the skin that formed a pattern. She reached for her digital microscope, the same tool she used to examine delicate daguerreotypes for authentication and restoration purposes. Under magnification on her computer screen, the marks became clearer and more disturbing. They formed a distinct pattern around the small throat, linear impressions, evenly spaced, that looked like pressure marks. And there, just visible above the dress collar, was a dark discoloration that spread from beneath the fabric. Rebecca sat back, her heart pounding. She'd curated an exhibition on Victorian mourning photography just 2 years ago. Post-mortem photography had been extremely common in the 19th century, especially for children who died young. Families would pose with their deceased loved ones, often trying to make them appear alive through careful positioning and sometimes painting open eyes on the closed lids or propping the body in a natural pose. But this child's eyes were open, genuinely open, and yet she was clearly dead. The fixed stare, the unnatural stillness, the way she was being held upright, all pointed to post-mortem photography. But those marks on her neck suggested something far more sinister than illness or accident. Rebecca spent the rest of that day carefully examining every detail of the photograph. She noted the studio backdrop, the furniture, the clothing, searching for any clue that might identify the family or explain the disturbing image. The reverse of the photograph offered little beyond the date and the cryptic. Note, "The Family," written in what appeared to be the same hand that had labeled many of the studio's other works, presumably the photographer. The next morning, Rebecca began searching through the accompanying materials from the Whitmore estate. Among the boxes of negatives were several leather-bound ledgers, the studio's business records dating from 1885 to 1902. She carried them to her desk with gloved hands. These documents were historically valuable in their own right, offering insight into the business, practices and clientele of a 19th century photography studio. She opened the 1889 ledger and began scanning through the entries for April. The handwriting was meticulous. Each appointment logged with the client's name, the type of sitting, the number of prints ordered, and the amount paid. Most entries were routine. Anderson family portrait, 3 prints, $8.50. Or Miss Henley, single portrait, 2 prints, $3.25. Then she found it. April 14th, 1889. The entry read, "Special sitting, family portrait, private session, paid in advance, 25 hours." No name was given. The amount was extraordinarily high, more than 3 times the typical cost of a family portrait. and the notation private session was unusual. Most sittings were conducted during regular business hours, often with multiple clients waiting their turn. Rebecca cross-referenced the date with the photograph. April 1889 matched. She continued reading through the ledger, searching for any other special or private sessions. She found 3 more over the next 2 years, all similarly expensive, all lacking client names. But the April 1889 entry had an additional notation in the margin, added in different ink, as if written later. Negatives retained, do not destroy. This was significant. The studio typically destroyed old negatives after 5 years, unless the client paid for storage. Yet someone had specifically marked this negative to be preserved. Rebecca pulled out her phone and photographed the ledger page, then continued searching. Rebecca's research into the Whitmore photography studio revealed a complex history. The studio had been founded in 1883 by Jonathan Whitmore, a skilled photographer who'd trained in New York before establishing his Boston practice. He'd built a reputation for high-quality portraiture, attracting middle-class and wealthy clients who appreciated his technical skill and artistic eye. But Whitmore's personal papers, also part of the estate acquisition, told a darker story. Rebecca found letters, journal entries, and newspaper clippings that painted a picture of a man increasingly troubled by what he witnessed through his camera lens. A journal entry from 1890 read, "I have documented joy and sorrow, life and death through my camera for 7 years now. But there are some images that haunt me, some truths captured on glass that burden my conscience. What is my obligation when I suspect wrongdoing? Am I merely a recorder of what is presented to me, or do I bear responsibility for what I choose to preserve?" Another entry from 1891 was more explicit. "I have seen death many times in my studio. Parents bring their deceased children, wishing to have one final portrait, one lasting memory. This is a service I provide without judgment. Grief is grief, and memory is precious. But what of the times when death seems suspicious? When the marks on the body suggest violence rather than illness? When the family's demeanor is wrong, not grief, but something else? Fear, guilt? I am not a policeman. I am a photographer. Yet these images stay with me." Rebecca's hands trembled as she read. Whitmore had recognized that something was wrong with some of his subjects. The final relevant entry was dated 1893. "I've decided to keep certain negatives separate from the regular studio inventory. These are the troubling ones, the images that speak to questions I cannot answer. Perhaps one day someone will examine them and understand what I suspected but could not prove. Until then, they remain locked away, silent witnesses to possible crimes." Rebecca realized she was holding evidence that Whitmore himself had considered potentially criminal. She returned to the photograph of the family, looking at it with new understanding. This wasn't just a mourning portrait. It was evidence that the photographer had deliberately preserved, suspecting foul play. Rebecca knew she needed expert analysis. She contacted Dr. Michael Chen, a forensic anthropologist at Boston University who specialized in historical cases and had consulted on several cold cases involving old photographs and skeletal remains. When he arrived at the museum 2 days later, Rebecca had the photograph prepared under optimal lighting conditions. Michael examined the image first with the naked eye, then with various magnification tools. His expression grew increasingly grave. After 30 minutes of careful study, he sat back and met Rebecca's eyes. "This child was dead when this photograph was taken," he confirmed. The fixed pupils, the complete absence of any movement blur, the positioning, all consistent with post-mortem photography. "But these marks on the neck," he pointed to his computer screen, where the magnified image showed the linear impressions clearly. "These are consistent with manual strangulation. See the pattern? These are finger marks, specifically an adult's fingers pressed into the throat of a child. The spacing, the depth, the bruising pattern. This child was asphyxiated." Rebecca felt sick. Could it have been accidental? A medical procedure gone wrong? Michael shook his head. "Manual strangulation requires sustained pressure. The hyoid bone in a child this young is still cartilaginous, which means it takes deliberate, sustained force to cause death this way. And look here." He pointed to another area of magnification. "There's what appears to be petechial hemorrhaging visible in the conjunctiva of the eyes. That's caused by pressure that blocks blood flow. This was homicide. But why would someone photograph evidence of murder?" Rebecca asked. "In the 19th century, post-mortem photography was so common that it might not have seemed suspicious," Michael explained. "If the family presented this as a natural death and wanted a memorial portrait, the photographer might not have immediately questioned it. But Whitmore clearly noticed the marks. Based on his journals, he preserved the evidence hoping someone would eventually investigate." Michael continued his analysis, measuring and documenting every detail. The positioning of the mother's hands, the family's expressions, the staging of the scene, everything pointed to a carefully constructed facade. "I need to report this," Michael said finally. "This is evidence of a homicide, even if it's over 130 years old." Detective Sarah Martinez of the Boston Police Department's Cold Case Unit had handled unusual cases before, but a murder from 1889 was unprecedented. She arrived at the museum with a skeptical expression that gradually transformed into deep concern as Rebecca and Michael presented their findings. Even if this is evidence of murder, what can we possibly do after 130 years? Sarah asked, studying the photograph intently. Everyone involved is long dead. Justice, Rebecca said quietly. And identification. This child deserves to have her story told. Someone killed her and posed with her body for a portrait. That can't simply be forgotten because time has passed. Sarah nodded slowly. Walk me through everything you know. She pulled out a digital recorder and began documenting the details. The ledger entry, the photographer's journals, the forensic analysis of the marks, all of it went into her official report. When they finished, Sarah made several calls, then turned back to them. I'm opening an official investigation. The department has agreed this warrants resources. Our first step is identification. We need to know who this family was. She photographed the portrait with her phone. I'm sending this to our research department. We'll cross-reference it with missing children reports from 1889, death records, newspaper archives, anything that might give us a name. Over the next week, Sarah's team worked through historical records. Boston in 1889 had been a city of over 400,000 people with dozens of deaths recorded every day. But they were looking for something specific. A young girl, approximately 5 years old, who died in April 1889 under circumstances that might have been questioned. They found her in the archives of the Boston Evening Transcript. A small article dated April 16, 1889, reported the death of Emily Thornton, age 5, daughter of Walter and Clara Thornton. The cause of death was listed as sudden illness, croup. The family had declined an autopsy, which was their right. The child was buried quickly, within 2 days, at Mount Auburn Cemetery. The article noted that Emily was survived by her parents and her older brother, Daniel, age 13. Sarah looked at Rebecca and Michael. Emily Thornton, now we have a name. And now we need to find out who killed her and why the family covered it up. Sarah's investigation into the Thornton family revealed a portrait of respectable middle-class life hiding something darker. Walter Thornton had been a bookkeeper at a shipping company, a steady but unremarkable position. Clara had been the daughter of a local shopkeeper, married at 18, and had given birth to Daniel in 1876 and Emily in 1884. City directories and census records tracked the family through their moves across Boston. They'd lived in a modest home in the South End, a neighborhood of row houses populated by clerks, shopkeepers, and skilled workers. Neighbors in 1889 would have seen an ordinary family, a hard-working father, a devoted mother, 2 children. But Sarah found cracks in this facade. Boston City Hospital records included an entry from March 1889, 1 month before Emily's death. Emily had been brought in with a broken arm. The attending physician's notes described the mother's explanation. Child fell downstairs. The doctor had set the bone and discharged the patient, but he'd added a marginal note. Fracture pattern unusual for described accident. Appears more consistent with twisting force. 2 years earlier, in 1887, there was another hospital visit. Emily, then 3 years old, had been treated for severe bruising across her back and shoulders. The explanation, child fell from bed. Again, the physician had noted his doubts, but had no authority to pursue them further. Sarah dug deeper, into school records, and found that Daniel Thornton had been noted by teachers as sullen and withdrawn with unexplained absences. A letter from his teacher to his parents, found in school archives, expressed concern about Daniel's defensive attitude and visible distress when asked about home life. Then Sarah found something that made everything click into place. A police report from May 1890, 1 year after Emily's death, documented that Clara Thornton had been briefly detained for public intoxication and disturbing the peace. The arresting officer's report noted that she'd been found outside a church, screaming that she needed to confess, that God would punish her. She was released into her husband's custody the next morning. No charges were filed. The pattern was clear now. A family where domestic violence was occurring, where a child was being abused, where eventually that abuse had turned fatal, and then the family had covered it up with a respectable funeral and a memorial photograph. Sarah's most significant breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While researching the Thornton family genealogy, she found that Daniel Thornton had lived until 1954, dying at age 77. More importantly, she discovered that in 1948, at age 71, he had written a memoir that was deposited with the Massachusetts Historical Society but never published. Sarah obtained permission to access the document, and she, Rebecca, and Michael gathered in the Historical Society's reading room to examine it. The memoir was titled Burdens of Memory, A Boston Childhood. Much of it covered Daniel's later life, his career as a bank manager, his marriage and children. But the chapters about his early life told a harrowing story. Daniel wrote about growing up in a home where his mother suffered from what he called dark moods and violent rages, likely what would now be recognized as severe mental illness, possibly bipolar disorder with psychotic features. His father, he wrote, was weak and complicit, more concerned with maintaining appearances than protecting his children. Then came the chapter about Emily. Daniel's words, written when he was an old man looking back across decades, were devastating. My little sister Emily was an innocent, sweet child who bore the brunt of our mother's worst episodes. Father would leave for work, and Mother would turn her rage on Emily. I tried to protect her, but I was just a boy, and Mother was cunning enough to hide the worst when Father was home. The memoir described the night Emily died. It was April 13th, 1889. Father was working late. I heard Emily crying from her room, then Mother's angry voice. I ran upstairs and found Mother with her hands around Emily's throat. I tried to pull her away, but I was not strong enough. By the time I got Mother off her, Emily was not breathing. I screamed and screamed, but Emily was gone. Daniel wrote that his father returned home to find Emily dead and his wife in a state of collapse. Father made a decision that night that I have never forgiven. He said we would tell everyone Emily died of croup, a common enough childhood illness. He said Mother would be institutionalized and the family destroyed if the truth came out. He said I must never speak of what I saw. He made me swear on the Bible. The memoir described how Walter Thornton paid a doctor to sign a death certificate listing croup as the cause without examining the body. Then came the most chilling part. Father insisted we have a family photograph taken with Emily before the burial. He said we needed a final portrait to remember her by, and that having one would make the death seem more natural to those who knew us. I had to sit there, next to Mother who had just murdered my sister, and pose for that photograph, while Emily's body sat propped in Mother's lap. It was the most horrible thing I've ever experienced. The photographer seemed to sense something was wrong, but Father paid him extra to take the portrait and ask no questions. Daniel's memoir provided crucial missing details. He wrote that his mother was indeed institutionalized later in 1889, after a public breakdown in May. She spent the rest of her life in the Boston Lunatic Hospital, dying there in 1902. Walter Thornton continued working at the shipping company until his death in 1911. Daniel had left home at 16 as soon as he was able, and never spoke to his father again. Sarah located records from the Boston Lunatic Hospital, now long closed. Clara Thornton's admission papers from May 1890 listed her diagnosis as moral insanity with violent tendencies. The intake notes, written by Dr. Aaron Marcus, included a telling observation. Patient exhibits extreme guilt and repeatedly confesses to harming her daughter. Claims to have squeezed the life out of the child during an episode she cannot fully recall, unable to determine if this is delusional or a genuine confession. The doctor's notes continued, husband insists patient is delusional, that their daughter died of natural illness. However, patient's specific and consistent testimony suggests otherwise. As the child is already buried, and the husband refuses to consent to exhumation or investigation, I can only document these statements for the record. Rebecca felt tears in her eyes as she read these documents. Dr. Marcus had suspected the truth, just as the photographer Jonathan Whitmore had suspected. Both had preserved evidence in the only ways available to them, hoping someone might eventually piece together what had happened. Sarah compiled everything into a comprehensive report. Though no prosecution was possible after 134 years, the case was officially documented as a homicide. Emily Thornton's death certificate was amended in the state records to reflect death by asphyxiation homicide with a notation explaining the historical investigation. Michael prepared a forensic report detailing his analysis of the photograph and explaining how modern techniques had revealed evidence that would have been impossible to detect in 1889. The report was published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, bringing attention to how historical photographs could provide evidence in long unsolved cases. Rebecca worked with the museum board to create a special exhibition, Silent Witnesses, Photography, and Justice. The exhibition featured the Thornton family photograph alongside the full story of Emily's death, Daniel's testimony, and the attempts by Whitmore and Dr. Marcus to document the truth. It became one of the museum's most visited exhibitions, prompting dozens of historians and genealogists to re-examine their own historical photographs with new eyes. 6 months after the investigation concluded, on a crisp October morning, a small group gathered at Mount Auburn Cemetery. Rebecca, Sarah, Michael, and several members of the Thornton family's living descendants stood before a newly installed headstone beside Emily's original grave marker. The original stone, placed by Walter Thornton in 1889, read simply, Emily Thornton, 1884-1889, gone to angels. The new marker, funded by the museum and the descendants, told the fuller truth. Emily Thornton, child and victim, 1884 to 1889. Her voice was silenced, but her story is finally heard. May she rest in peace, and may justice, though delayed, bring some measure of healing. Among the descendants present was Daniel Thornton's granddaughter, Patricia, now 72 years old. She held a folder containing copies of her grandfather's memoir. Grandpa Daniel carried this burden his entire life, she said softly. He told me about Emily when I was a teenager, made me promise to tell the story if I ever had the chance. He wanted people to know what happened to his little sister. Wanted her to be remembered as more than just another child who died young. Thank you for giving Emily her voice back. Rebecca thought about Jonathan Whitmore, the photographer who had preserved the evidence despite not knowing if anyone would ever understand its significance. She thought about Dr. Marcus, who documented Clara's confession even though he couldn't act on it. She thought about Daniel, who wrote his memoir decades later, hoping someone would read it and finally reveal the truth. The photograph that had started this journey now hung in the museum, not hidden away, but displayed openly with the full context of Emily's story. Visitors stood before it in silence, many visibly moved by the image's tragic history. Children who came with school groups learned about Emily and about how important it is to protect vulnerable people, to speak up when something seems wrong, to ensure that victims are not forgotten. Rebecca returned to the museum that afternoon and stood before the photograph. Emily's glassy eyes stared out from 1889, frozen in death, but now, finally, acknowledged. The little girl in the white dress with the fatal marks on her neck was no longer an anonymous victim in an unnamed photograph. She was Emily Thornton, a 5-year-old child who had suffered and died at her mother's hands, whose father had prioritized reputation over justice, whose brother had carried guilt and grief for 70 years, but Emily's story had finally been told. The photograph that was meant to conceal murder had instead preserved evidence that eventually revealed the truth. And in that revelation, in the public acknowledgement of what had happened to her, Emily Thornton had received something that had been denied to her for 134 years. Recognition, remembrance, and a form of justice that, while impossible to deliver to her in life, could at least honor her memory in death. Rebecca touched the frame gently. "Rest in peace, Emily," she whispered. "Your story matters. You matter. And now everyone knows." Outside the museum, the October sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city that had once silenced a child's suffering. But inside, in the carefully lit exhibition hall, Emily's photograph served as a permanent reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, can eventually come to light, and that even after more than a century, justice and remembrance are still possible.